We won't stop the killing. Every week of this trial, like every week of the past 7 years, will be measured by new Hiroshimas and by new lies, by the deaths and imprisonment of Americans, and by tens of thousands of new Indo-Chinese killed, wounded, or made homeless. We won't stop that. But this trial will inform the American public in ways that it's never heard before of how we've been governed in the past quarter century and what censorship and deception do to a democracy.
There you go. Hi, everybody. I'm Randy Credico, live on the fly, here on both the Progressive Radio Network and WBAI Pacifica, WBAI.org, 99.5 FM in New York City. Today, we have three Marines on, three famous Marines on. You saw First Lieutenant Daniel Ellsberg there, who's been on this show many times. And we have Captain Scott Ritter, who's been on this show many times, and Field Commander, I think that's the name of it, Matthew Ho, who was on just the other day, and we really had a great conversation. And I want to continue this discussion because we are, I believe, at an existential point because of the situation in Eastern Europe. We're going to go to and I think these three Marines can answer a lot of questions. And I want them to actually engage, and I want to be a fly on the wall and learn something, and you'll learn a lot too. So let's play this quick video to set it up. This is Barry McGuire, and we'll be right back with these three wonderful individuals.
Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And even the Jordan River has bodies floating. But you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't we're on the eve of destruction. Don't you understand what I'm trying to say? Can't you feel the fears I'm feeling today? If the button is pushed, there's no running away. There'll be no one to save with the world in a grave. Take a look around you, boy. It's bound to scare you, boy. And you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
All right. Well, there you go. Can we bring all these wonderful individuals? And Scott, I guess it is Captain Scott Ritter, and I know it's Field Commander Matthew Ho and First Lieutenant who cashiered out in 1957, went on to the Rand Corporation and delivered the greatest story of all time. That was to me what really prompted the end of the Vietnam War. Thank you. And that, of course, is Daniel Ellsberg. You folks both, you, Matthew, and you, Scott, both are friends with Daniel.
I am proud to call myself a friend of Daniel Ellsberg. I put it like the number one thing on my resume. People say, "Who are you?" I say, "I'm a friend of Daniel Ellsberg."
And Scott, because Scott, I mean, not Scott. Matthew Scott, Luke, and John. All right. So you've known him for a while, and go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, if I was to pan my camera to the left here, I've got a big picture of the first time that I met Dan, here in my office. Alongside of next to that is the bolo for Ray McGovern when the State Department security office was after him. So those are the two photos I have here to kind of keep me grounded in who I am and why I'm doing this, and the gratefulness I have for people like Dan and for Scott, because I didn't speak out about these things until well after Scott had become public and had been trashed and had been ruined for it. Right. So I'm really proud to be here, and grateful for you to put this together, Randy. Just to clear it up, I was a captain in the Marine Corps. Scott was a major. Yeah. So no.
I'm sorry.
And these are two Marines that make me proud to have been a Marine. Like General Smedley Butler, I happen to have just been reading more about him lately. But you two are very much in his tradition. Right. And of course, you both outrank me and spend a lot more time in the Marines.
All right. Well, let's bring up some Smedley Butler here. Yes, Smedley Butler. I'm a big Wars of Racket, and if I had known we were going to bring him up, and he was a lieutenant general in the Marines for 40 years. I'm going to go to you right away. Look, the theme of this show is about the threat of nuclear war. I just, I've spoken to Scott about this and Matthew about it. I now think about the possibility or the probability of it every day. I used to think it was an obscure, no chance scenario, but now it's becoming more and more concrete. And I want to get, since you wrote The Doomsday Machine 7 or 8 years ago, Danielle, your thoughts about where we are.
I think it's true. As President Biden actually said, surprisingly, that there's more of a risk of nuclear war than there's been any time, he put it, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I participated, actually. One could argue, actually, that we were even closer at one point in time, there in 1983, when some false alarms put Andropov, minister, on the alert for a possible U.S. first strike, and he was ready to preempt. But most people don't know about that. In terms of the possibility of U.S. troops fighting Russian troops, which will bring that possibility of escalation of nuclear war much closer than it is now, even now, that was true in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in fact, that's the one occasion on which one member of the superpower was shot down, by another member of the superpower. That's when Anderson, in his U-2, was shot down on October 26, 1962, which I remember very well. I was in the Pentagon at that time. And there have been other deaths, actually, covertly, but not acknowledged by either side, really, on reconnaissance flights of various kinds. Not all reconnaissances it's carried out by balloons, although a lot was in the 50s. We've seen a lot of balloons over Russia. But there have been various other penetrations and so forth. Planes have been shot down, but not acknowledged. What we're facing now is a possible, if we were to carry out the escalations of this war that have been proposed by people like Hillary Clinton or out of office, or Zelensky, in fact, about a no-fly zone all this time. That would involve over conflict between the U.S. and Russian troops for the first time ever since there was a Soviet Union. Well, let's go back to 1919. Since 1919, when we invaded Russia. But since then, nothing. And Scott, you quoted a quote from the former President Medvedev that I thought was very significant. He said, let's see, I have it here. Yeah, here it is. Quote from Scott in January. Medvedev, former Russian president, close advisor to Putin, added on Twitter that those who promote a Russian defeat, and of course, Zelensky has stated, and with no reservation from the U.S. allies, that nothing less than Russian removal from Crimea and total removal from the Donbass. In other words, back to back to 2014, actually, 2013, not just to last year, is satisfactory even for negotiations. The Russians have to be entirely out of Ukraine, including Crimea, and that would be a total Russian defeat. Medvedev says none of them get it that a nuclear power's loss of a conventional war can lead to a nuclear one. Nuclear powers haven't been defeated in major conflicts crucial for their destiny. Well, we can argue about what's crucial for a destiny, but we can be a little more specific than that. Major powers, nuclear powers, have not been defeated by a peer, by another nuclear power in the Cold War, in my lifetime, let's say, it started in 1931. It's one thing, the way I interpret that statement is this. Actually, each side, the US and Russia, have each allowed themselves, in effect, to be defeated, to be totally thwarted in their initial aims. The US in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, and we can name others. The Russians definitely in Afghanistan again. It's one thing, though, without using nuclear weapons, something that, by the way, that was not foreseen in the late 40s or early 50s exactly. It was just assumed that somebody with nuclear weapons who was facing defeat in any kind of conflict would use those nuclear weapons, especially against an adversary that didn't have nuclear weapons, which was true, of course, in Afghanistan in both cases and in Vietnam. So how could we explain this here? Well, looking back, I think we can say each side, neither side could be, let's take one at a time, but it's true of all of these. The nuclear power could not be defeated on the battlefield. It couldn't have a military defeat such as the Germans suffered, the Japanese suffered in World War II. The other side couldn't defeat them actually in practically any battle. But as I remember somebody said once at one point in Vietnam, I remember somebody saying, we're winning battles closer and closer to Saigon. That didn't seem to be a good sign. The key thing, though, was that although we were winning the battles, we could say finally, well, this place doesn't matter that much to us, and it costs too much. It's going on too long, it costs too much. We'll cross it off. We don't need it. And that's what they did eventually. But to be defeated by someone who could possibly defeat you militarily in terms of prestige and international influence and everything else, we haven't seen that possibility. There haven't been two major nuclear powers fighting each other on that way. And where I think neither side will want to accept something that can be described as a total defeat. On the other hand, let me come right to this case. I don't think, and we may get some disagreement here between us, but I don't think that either side, the Ukraine backed by at least logistically and material and weapons by the US and others. I don't think that Russia is going to defeat them in a sense of certainly of their initial aims, which did involve Kiev, whatever they may say about it. They're not going to get Kiev from the US, from Ukraine and Russia. And I think Zelensky's aims are not ever going to be achieved without, in fact, as Medvedev and Putin have implied, without their willingness to use nuclear weapons, at least demonstratively, to block that. In other words, I don't see any possibility of Ukrainians, even with US weapons, driving Russians out of Crimea in particular, but even totally out of the Donbass. Who can say, everybody, certainly I'm not presenting myself as somebody who can make a very strong estimate on that. And by the way, Scott here was a major intelligence officer. I was a rifle company commander, which I'm very proud of, as a first lieutenant. But that's the limit of my ground operations. And Matt was a company commander in combat, which is a very good thing. But I don't think they can get out. They're not going to get out. Zelensky's aims are not going to be achievable. But if the U.S. came in directly, now with U.S. air power in particular, then I think the Russians, this is the top of the head, the Russians would be facing the possibility that they might be forced entirely out of the Donbass and Crimea. They could mobilize for war and make that very unlikely, in a way, even against America. But they would be facing that, and that would, I think, raise the risk of at least demonstrative use of Russian nuclear weapons in a way that's very risky for the world.
All right. So, Scott, Daniel wrote the book, The Doomsday Machine. You wrote two of them, Scorpion King and the Disarmament in the Age of Perestroika. So you want to go over some of the points that Daniel just shared with us, and then
first of all, Dan may have been a rifle company commander as a first lieutenant, but he was also one of the premier analytical brains in Rand Corporation. So don't let anybody listening let this old timer try and sell himself short. That brain is a super weapon, and you should listen to every word he says. Look, we don't know how the war is going to end on the ground in Ukraine. I have a little different spin. I think Russia's going to win decisively. I think Ukraine is smoking marijuana, and this war is over. But therein comes the problem. Dan's 100% correct. No nuclear armed power has lost a war against a nuclear armed power. Just hasn't happened. However, and this is where I think it gets really dangerous. The United States did defeat the Soviet Union, not in combat, but as an overall geopolitical struggle. The Soviet Union collapsed for a number of reasons: internal reasons, significant, but also external pressure, the inability to align perestroika and glasnost with anything that manifested itself real, and we collapsed. And then we had the decade of the 90s, where the United States and Europe pretty much tried to dismember Russia, was exploiting Russia, was trying to destroy Russia. And what's important about that is, see, when I look at Ukraine, I don't think there's anybody in the Pentagon who thinks that Ukraine is going to win this conflict. If they do, they should be relieved on site because they're militarily incompetent. I don't think there's anybody in the Pentagon that is pushing for a force-on-force struggle between NATO and Russia, because the likelihood of that manifesting itself in nuclear conflict is extraordinarily high. And you can say whatever negative things you want about the generals in the Pentagon, and I say a lot of negative things about them. They're not suicidal. They didn't get 4 stars because they want to die. They got 4 stars because they want a pension. They want to get the nice Raytheon contract, and they want to live as millionaires. So what's going on here? And we got an insight into it, because when you look at the Ukraine conflict, you have to go beyond the ground in Ukraine and think globally. You have to think in terms of economic sanctions. You have to think in terms of what America's policy towards Russia has been for the last decade plus. It's a policy of regime change, dating back to Barack Obama, Michael McFaul, the implementation of the Russian reset, which was really regime change, trying to get Medvedev to replace Putin in the hopes that Medvedev would become a new Yeltsin, allowing us to repeat the decade of the 90s, which is what the dream, the fantasy of all these Russophobic people in Washington, D.C. want. They want to return to the 90s. They want to get rid of Russia's strong president and put in a weak Russian president. So the war in Ukraine isn't about the military defeat of Russia. Never has been. It's about the geopolitical collapse of Russia. Go back to Rand, 2019, writing the report to talk about stripping Ukraine away from Russia as a prerequisite for the collapse of Russia. Now, I don't know if they can physically strip it away, but what the hope is by luring Russia in. And the reason why I say luring Russia in is go back and read William Burns' 2008 memorandum, Niet means Niet. He specifically said, if we invite Ukraine, this will inevitably lead to a series of events that has Russia militarily intervening in Ukraine. So we knew from 2008 on that if we invited Ukraine to NATO, it would inevitably lead to a Russian military incursion, which we have been preparing for, not to defeat Russia, but to create the conditions inside Russia for a similar collapse like the Soviet Union. The Ukrainians and NATO call it the Moscow Maidan. It's what they've been thinking about all along. We had a Harvard professor, Kenneth Rogoff, I think, at Davos, outright saying that the economic sanctions were about regime change. The idea of economic sanctions is to create so much economic turmoil that the people rise up. And you combine that with the ability to prevent a Russian military victory in Ukraine, which is the essential key. Prevent a Russian military victory, not to defeat Russia, prevent a victory that keeps Russia there bleeding, so that you collapse the morale inside Russia and you get a repeat of 1991, where the government collapses and is replaced by something that'll be more sympathetic to American and Western control. This is the danger. But here's where the United States loses it. And I maybe Daniel will get this, and Matt too. See, I don't think Russia's losing. They're winning economically. The sanctions have failed. I don't think they're losing on the battlefield. I believe this war, the fighting part, is going to be done by the end of summer, early fall. Ukraine simply can't sustain this fight. They don't have the troops. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the economy. They don't have anything. Plus, they're losing the backing of Europe, which is talking big, but not delivering big. I think what's going to happen is that the United States is going to be facing a massive geopolitical defeat in the near future that, if left unchecked, could lead to the collapse of NATO. And here's the risk. Not that Russia will use a nuclear weapon, but the United States will use a nuclear weapon. We're the only one with the preemptive nuclear posture right now. We're the only one that say we can use nuclear weapons first. And Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, Korea. Wasn't it MacArthur that said when the Chinese came in, let's drop nukes along the border to stop the Chinese? We're the ones that talk about using nuclear weapons. Wasn't it Vietnam where we actually got the special forces guys geared up on Okinawa to go in with the backpack nukes to take out Tokyo? We're the ones that talk about using nuclear weapons. That's the threat. Not that Russia's going to do anything. We're going to do it because we're going to be confronted with a geopolitical disaster that we're not prepared to deal with. That's my take.
All right, now before we respond to that, I got to go to Matthew because you've been on the battlefield. I answer what both Daniel and Scott just brought up, but talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the battlefield and what you saw in Afghanistan when you resigned from the State Department and your position there.
Yeah. What worries me, and I'm really enjoying listening to both, Dan and Scott talk about this and the wisdom that's being expressed here. And I tend to agree with Scott more in terms of the likely outcome of the Ukraine war. But, like I said a year ago, when the invasion occurred, was anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen has no idea what they're talking about. And whenever I get asked about what do you predict to happen, I usually quote Yogi Berra. And I say predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future, because but this is what scares me. What worries me is that the same people that were in charge during the Afghan war, during the Iraq war, the Syrian war, the Yemen war, the Libyan war, the wars all throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The United States has been in combat in 17 countries since 2001. I bet most Americans don't know that, and I would bet all but a handful of senators and Congress people know that as well. It's the same people who are in charge over and over again. Some are interchangeable between Democrats, Republicans, but these are the same people that have brought us these wars. You got to remember Joe Biden on the eve of the Iraq invasion 20 years ago. His statement was, "Let loose the dogs of war." This is the mindset these people have. This is and their inability to accept information that does not align with their motivations and their goals is very limited. I tell all these stories about going in to Congress, say, in 2009, 2010, 2011, talking about the Afghan war, and just being told by members of Congress, including, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, I've never had a negative briefing on the war in Afghanistan. And so you have to wonder what information is going to these people. They already have a mindset. They already have shown what their experience is. You've already seen that they have had leading roles or have been in charge of all these wars that have been so disastrous for so many millions of people. And that led to terrible outcomes. Look, not after 9/11, Al-Qaeda had between 200 and 400 people total worldwide. That's it. And then because of our wars, they grew to a strength of tens and tens and tens of thousands of people, took over territory, took over whole cities, conquered half of Syria and half of Iraq. Because of our wars, because of what we did to encourage their movement, right? And to give them a lot of things. People flocked to their cause because we proved their narrative right by what we did. And they did the same thing. Our leadership did the same thing then again in Syria. And they did the same thing in Libya and Yemen, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the people who are in charge. And that's what worries me, is that this type of understanding of where the war could be heading, and it's particularly settling into a stalemate, the understanding of escalation. One of the commentators I listen to quite a lot, he uses the phrase escalation escalator as opposed to the escalation ladder. And I think that's a very, very apt description of where they're on, because as he says, you can't escalator. It's automatic. It's going to the top and there's no getting off it. Try walking back down it. It's very difficult. You can't get off left or right. And his comments in that way, I think, as you see the continual escalation of the war in Ukraine, more and more weapons, you see more and more exposure of the American involvement. The Washington Post just had a big story about how basically all the targeting for the long-range rockets the Ukrainians have is coming from the Americans. They can't use those weapons without the targets we give them, which makes sense if you know anything about those weapons. And so the United States is directly involved in the killing of Russian soldiers. We've been paying the salary of the Ukrainian army since last March. So if you're paying an army salary, that's your army. So the deepening of this escalation and the fact that, we're not going to give them HIMARS, we're not going to give them Abrams tanks, we're not going to give them missiles that can go farther than 50 miles, on and on and on. And now they'll eventually get fighter jets, et cetera. But that lack of understanding of escalation, the lack of humility for what we've been through. And I think a lot of the things that, say, are earlier presidents during the Cold War, rather say Eisenhower, who, of course, as everyone is familiar with, criticized quite strongly the military-industrial complex. He also criticized quite heavily American generals and admirals, and the same with John F. Kennedy. I think they understood the dynamics here that I think our leadership does not appreciate. And you can see that with reckless decisions such as, say, either ending negotiations that could have ended this war back in March because they wanted to win against Russia, whatever that means, or by, say, the Nord Stream pipeline destruction, which was an act of war against another country that our congressional leaders had no idea about.
Well, I was going to bring that up next to Daniel. By the way, this is fascinating, and I'm going to go back to the wall and with my wings here and listen, Daniel, about the Nord Stream story by Seymour Hersh. I cannot gainsay or confute anything that Seymour Hersh comes out with. Do you believe his story? Or do you believe the press secretary of Joe Biden?
Well, my friend Cy isn't always right, as he knows. And I think there's a good solid 5% chance he's totally wrong on this one, or make it 10%. But the plausibility of what he's saying is so great that Cy told me yesterday that somebody had congratulated him but said, "You have a wonderful talent for deconstructing the obvious. It's obvious." And I wrote him back and I said, that sounds like all the left people and the anti-war people when I came out with the Pentagon Papers who said, we knew that all along. And that's true. But the documents, in this case, Cy doesn't have documents, but his source sounds very good to me. So, but it's essentially plausible. And here's where I would take a little different frame now when it comes to broadening the frame here to a geopolitical thing. I certainly agree that the U.S. has hardly made a secret that they would like regime change going way back with Hillary Clinton, back to the 2006, 7, 8, but or after that, Hillary's after that. But that's not the only frame to look at this in. our relations with Russia or the situation of Russia, where indeed there is no sign as of yet that this has accomplished a lessening of Putin's power, his popularity. The sanctions have obviously failed at what Biden predicted early on. Will crush, will bring them to their knees and so forth. For who knows, a variety of reasons, that hasn't worked at all, and it's punished Western Europe, obviously, and other places much more than Russia so far. But U.S. relations with Western Europe, and now including Eastern Europe, what used to be Eastern Europe, that's another matter. Actually, when Scott is actually looking ahead to the breakup of NATO over a great failure here. Possibly, everything's possible. I frankly put that in the category of the possibility that Russia blew up the Nord Stream 2. So there's a big disagreement between us there. The Nord Stream 2, and for that matter, 1, has been an object of our extreme opposition from the time it was installed and from the time it was about to be opened up, the Nord Stream 2. We've been against it. That's gone, obviously, by the U.S. and with help, apparently, according to Sy, from Norway and others, very happily. Now, what does that mean? That really was a major objective. That wasn't going to bring down Russia. Getting out Nord Stream 2 is not going to lead to regime change in Russia. It is going to change to a change necessarily under U.S. pressure of German relations with Russia, German dependence on cheap Russian gas and other energy, which we've opposed all along. In fact, this has led me to look back in my lifetime. Born in 1931, but on the beginnings of the Cold War, I think going back at least to the end of World War II, but really pretty much before that, long before that, the U.S. objective has been to prevent a strong rapprochement between Germany and Russia, which would ally Russian energy and manpower, as one person has put it, with German technology and capital. Somebody called it a marriage made in heaven. That was not something that the U.S. was prepared to bless. And we've been trying to prevent that, and we got it, thanks to Putin and us, working together. German, and there is now a wall between Russia and all of Europe so far. That may change back. Pretty hard to get back with the Germans, but anyway, not with Nord Stream 2. And they now have to get our liquefied natural gas, get it. Other gas, I understand, somebody, Ben Norton, I just saw the other day, was pointing out that there's a new pipeline just opened between Norway for gas and Germany. So our relations with West Europe have been improved so much, and I think not to the benefit of Russia, but to the benefit of the U.S., multinational corporations, the military-industrial complex, our leaders in general. This war is, as it is right now, not necessarily larger, but as it is now, is pure benefit. And to say that Russia is winning and will win, not on this front, because if you have no scruples about what you invest in, then by Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, they're not going to go down. You can only win. It can only go up. That's for the indefinite future. They've won big on this. Putin has been, as somebody said, the best salesman for F-35s that the military-industrial complex has ever had. And again, that doesn't hurt Russia in itself, but it's very good for our business. And in terms of NATO, which was brain dead, I think it was Jim Stoltenberg who actually said that at one point before the war, is now back in business with the U.S. in charge. And whereas we could have, as Scott said, going way back to the 90s, we could have encouraged an expansion of the European Union as an integrating force and as a democratizing force. But we don't control the European Union. We're not even in it. NATO is Cosa Nostra, our thing. And if Russia had actually entered NATO, well, that's a peculiar idea, which I'll mention in a minute, but which was mentioned as a possibility by Gorbachev, by Yeltsin, and early by Putin. If that had happened, what's the point of NATO altogether with Russia in it? NATO has any meaning under us, commanding with our nuclear threats, our commander of NATO, always an American, only if Russia is an enemy. And I think the U.S. has had, I now look back in a global, I think for the last 20 years at least, and one could argue for some people, definitely 25, going back to the 90s, the aim has been to resuscitate Russia, not an enemy in 1992, 1993. They're more communist, wants to be friendly, wants investment, wants a Marshall Plan, which it didn't get. It's hard to run an empire without Russia on this. So they wanted Russia as an enemy. And what the U.S. has been doing, quote, provocatively, and that's a fair term, all that time is to insult, humiliate, neglect, press Russia in ways that will lead Russia to act somehow to redefine itself as an enemy of the U.S. And that's been achieved. So that's a definite win. Whatever, if they took all of Ukraine, and I would like to ask, you don't have to do it now, but Scott, when you predict a Russian victory, I'd like to, and as I say, I defer to you as a military analyst. Definitely your last column on the logistics, the characteristics of all these weapons, very, very interesting. But I would like to hear what you define as a victory. Does that mean the original aim of regime change in Kiev? Very explicit. Getting rid of Zelensky, getting rid of the denazification in mid-Ukraine and West Ukraine altogether. Regime change, which they talked a lot about, but not so much lately. I don't think they're aiming at that victory now. Are you saying they are?
All right, Scott, your turn.
Well, I'll just start real quick. Yeah, Russia's going to win this thing and win it decisively. There's going to be two phases to the victory. First is military, which means demilitarization. It will be the total annihilation of the Ukrainian military. That's happening now. Modest casualty figures right now. There's talk that Zaluzhny himself, the Ukrainian general, told Mark Miley a month or so ago, 275,000 dead. I think that number is closer to 350,000. I think there's even more than that. This is the total annihilation of the Ukrainian army, and it's going to get worse. When the Russians finally engage, the total number of Ukrainian dead could come up to around 700, 800,000. You just don't walk away from that. That's what demilitarization looks like. And let's be frank, Russia wasn't looking for that for the beginning. This is a byproduct of the West's engagement in terms of resurrecting and sustaining the Ukrainian military. We are literally allowing them, as Lindsey Graham said, to fight to the last Ukrainian. And this sickens me. It just sickens me horribly because it didn't need to be this way. But now the tougher problem is denazification, because that's a political problem. I don't believe that demilitarization is going to require the Russians to go beyond Odessa or Kharkov. I don't see Russia right now. Who knows? Like you said, Matt, anybody, what's that Yogi Berra phrase? Anybody who thinks they know what's going to happen in the future, no, you don't. And we don't know what's going to happen. This war has gone through several morphines, and it probably could go through several more. So we don't know. But I think right now the Russian goal is to collapse Ukraine as a modern nation state, to bring it down as close to Neanderthal time as possible, which will result in the collapse of the Ukrainian government, and Zelensky will be removed from power, and the Ukrainians are going to put somebody in who will deal with Russia in the way Russia wants, which is a dictated, unconditional terms of surrender. That's what I see. Now, you talked about NATO. Before I get to NATO, let me just support this. NATO is a military alliance with a political aspect, but it is closely linked to two other elements. The European Union, the development of the European Union and NATO pretty much go side by side, even though they're two distinct entities, a lot of similar membership, and also the G7. Let's start with the G7 right now. It's a group of seven, the seven greatest economies in the world, but they're not anymore. They're actually not the seven greatest economies, especially after what has happened in the aftermath of the sanctions. The G7 is fundamentally weakened. Their influence has dropped dramatically outside of the G7 countries to be replaced by BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa Economic Forum, which is expanding as we speak. Almost every one of the BRICS nations is stronger than six of the seven, six of the seven BRICS countries. So their economies are on the downfall. So economically, the economic engine of NATO is in trouble. The G7 is the economic engine of NATO. It's in trouble. Now we go to the European Union, which is a political thing. If people don't understand that the European Union is linked to the Eurozone, and that the Eurozone is driven by three separate engines, Paris, Berlin, and Rome, those are the three primary currencies. Rome's getting ready to drop out. Giorgiano Melina, I can't pronounce her name. She's hostile towards the EU. Paris and Berlin have two completely different visions of how Europe should go. The Parisians are all free spending, liberal spending. The Germans are conservative. As you come to a fundamental economic crisis that the European Union is going to be confronting itself with in the years to come, those two are not going to come together. They're going to split apart. So I see the European Union not unifying, but fracturing. And now we come to NATO. Let's just talk about NATO for a second. Turkey. Money. Who's going to put money on Turkey being a NATO member in 10 years? I wouldn't. I'd put money on Turkey leaving NATO within 10 years. Germany. You really think that Germany is going to be a solid NATO partner after they had an economic Pearl Harbor perpetrated against them by the United States? This is going to be a political catastrophe in Germany, and it's going to lead to problems that have yet to manifest themselves as the economic consequences of America's act of war against Germany manifest themselves politically, domestically in Germany. And now we come to Hungary and Serbia. Two European nations. Hungary is a NATO member. Serbia is not. But what happens, let's say, if Russia does succeed in achieving the manifestation of Novaya Russia, and they do go through Odessa and come up and link up with Transnistria? What I see is that Russia is going to create a land corridor into Central Europe through Serbia and Hungary, connecting the two. And once that's done, Hungary's gone. So I've just put forward two guaranteed NATO members leaving NATO. One, Germany becoming openly hostile to the principal founder of NATO, the United States, and Serbia not playing ball. I don't see that as a healthy alliance. And I also see that when NATO is confronted with the cost of dealing with Russia, because Russia's not just winning in Ukraine. Russia just expanded their military to 1.5 million people, inclusive of a major grouping of forces now on the Kola Peninsula opposite of Finland who thought they were going to join NATO, but right now aren't because some idiot burned a Koran in Sweden and Turkey said, you're never coming in. But now that's a reality. The Russian army today, the 200,000 guys that went into Ukraine in last year were okay, but they weren't that good. I mean, we now know that we know that there were mistakes made, their doctrine needed to be massaged and all that stuff. The army that exists today is one of the most combat hardened, combat capable, combat experienced forces the modern world has ever seen, equipped with some of the best combat tested weaponry, with a doctrine that has evolved sufficiently to take on a NATO style army, which is what Ukraine is. This is a completely different problem set facing NATO than it was this time last year. NATO has no clue what they just did. There's an old saying, Russians are slow to harness, fast to ride. Well, thanks to NATO, the Russians have become harnessed and they are riding. And where is NATO? Treading water, doing nothing. Where's their defense industry? Doing nothing. What is Russia? Firing on all cylinders right now, cranking out 40, 90 tanks a month, T-90 tanks. They have all their industrial lines online. It hasn't impacted the economy. NATO thinks what? Germany's going to spend 100 billion euros to rebuild the German army? A dumb idea. Anytime you combine German militarism with German industry, bad idea, bad things happen. So hopefully the Germans back away from that. But France is talking about, they can't afford it. How do you afford the steel that goes into a tank when the energy prices are so high that the furnaces can't operate? German industry is shutting down. French industry is shutting down. And this is the industry they need to build these tanks. The German Minister of Defense, not Minister of Defense, one of their heavy defense guys said, Don't give away all the Leopards because we can't build replacements. They're too expensive. This is the reality. Europe and NATO have gotten themselves backed into a corner because of the United States. I've never seen NATO weaker than it is right now. The defeat in Afghanistan was a political defeat, not a military defeat. But what's happening in Ukraine right now is a military defeat for NATO. NATO's the arsenal of democracy, the modern day European, is being crushed by the Russians. They're sending in NATO equipment. It's being ground up. NATO has no doctrine, no nothing. I'll leave it with this. Stoltenberg got to in Madrid last June, said, we're going to expand the rapid response force to 300,000. It was supposed to pop. I was trying to be clever there. It ain't going to happen, Stoltenberg. Why? Well, the first thing that happened is all the defense ministers went, what? Why didn't you talk to us? There's this thing called the Military Council. Why aren't they saying it? Why are you saying this? You want us to upgrade all of our battalion battle groups in the Baltics to brigades? How are we going to do that? The British are going, what? We can't even get a brigade out right now. If you put the entire British military into an American, there's going to be a Super Bowl played later on today. I don't know how many people they could stuff into that stadium. 110,000? You could put the British Army in there and still have 40,000 unsold seats. No NATO army today can fight the Russians in a stand-up fight. The Ukrainian army is more combat capable than any other armed forces in Europe today, save the United States military. By the way, we only have 100,000 in Europe nowadays. Back in the old days, we could have 300,000 immediately reinforceable with 250,000. We got 100,000 now, and we're bankrupting ourselves trying to come up with an additional 4,000 to send in to reinforce them. I don't see warm and fuzzy things for the United States and NATO. I see nothing but problems. I see Russia actually being compelled to become something they never wanted to become. And here's the good news. Russia doesn't want to be the enemy of the West. Thank goodness. Could you imagine the situation we'd be in right now if Vladimir Putin thought like Joe Biden? If the Russians thought like American senators? If they were into global domination, global hegemony? If they were even into dominating Europe? They are not. Russia's about the defense of Russia and Russian security interests. That's it. And that's the best news I can impart to anybody right now, because all this fear about Russia driving on Warsaw and driving on Berlin and driving on to Paris, it ain't going to happen. The Russians don't want to do it. So I think NATO is going to have a hard time squaring the theory postulated by Biden and Stoltenberg with the harsh reality they're going to be confronting once the Ukrainian military is defeated and Ukraine collapses a modern nation state.
Wow, this is great. Let's continue. Matthew, your thoughts on what Daniel and Scott just said?
I think the Russian aims have been limited from the beginning, in the sense that I don't believe that they had a desire for regime change in Kiev in the sense of attacking and capturing a conquest. I think that was a move to push negotiations, to get the Ukrainians to the negotiations table and to end the war as quickly as possible. They were almost successful. I mean, as we know from the Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, as we know from the Turks, as we know from Fiona Hill, who was the darling of the Democratic Party's resistance when she was testifying against Donald Trump in the impeachment hearings, that there was a negotiated settlement in hand in the early March, and that, according to all those sources, was blocked by the United States and to some degree other European powers. And I think that was the goal of the Russians. I think the thing the Ukrainians have going for them, let me say, I think the Russian goal continues to be a territorial capture of eastern Ukraine, a buffer zone, say outside of the Donbass region, along with a corridor connecting that with Crimea. And I think that is their goal now. But I also think that with that goal in mind, you have the opportunity for negotiations. Whether the Russians will continue to be desirous of negotiations at this point, or whether, say, this reminds me very much what happened in Afghanistan, where in 07, 08, 09 into 10, the Taliban were trying to negotiate with the Americans. The Bush administration said, we're not going to do it. We're going to let the next administration take over. The Obama administration came in, just rejected it out of hand. We're going to win this militarily. They rebuffed the Taliban over and over and over again. I was I witnessed this. This is one of the reasons why I resigned from my position in Afghanistan in 2009. And what happened was the Taliban, after being rebuffed, defeated the 250,000 man army that the United States put into Afghanistan. People forget that we had a 250,000 man army in Afghanistan in 2010, 2011, 2012, 100,000 American troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and 100,000 contractors. And they defeated that. So why then, after they defeat that force, and now in 2014, 2015, the Americans are saying, okay, we'll talk now. Why are the Taliban going to do it on anything but their terms? And I'm afraid that's what's happened with what's going to happen with the Russians, is that the Russians said, hey, look, we had this opportunity. We made advances for negotiations before we invaded, right? I mean, there's been this whole process for years now, pox on both sides, if you will. But the invasion occurs. There's this opportunity for negotiations. It's scuttled. And then you're just going to say, we're going to fight it out. And now you're on the losing side. Why then do you think the stronger side is going to placate you and say, okay, yeah, we'll go along with the negotiations? Now, I think the one thing the Russians do realize that they don't have on their side, that the Americans do, the Ukrainians do, is the world's reserve currency. And the United States, as long as it wants to, as long as it has the will, it can afford this war in Ukraine. Look, we spent $8 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and walked away from them and pretending like they never happened now. We can do the same thing in Ukraine. What I think one of the great successes for Russia in this, and Scott alluded to this with the BRICS countries, is that strengthening of the BRICS countries, of those relationships. The explosion in Russian trade this past year, in spite of the sanctions, particularly with their BRICS partners, with the Indians, the Chinese, with the South Africans are down there doing naval war games with the South Africans. The Brazilians have sent very mixed signals on their attitude towards this war, but especially the economic exchanges that have occurred, the increased trade between these nations, and the strengthened economic relationship, particularly, say, between China and Russia now. Or what we've seemed to have done the impossible. If you talk to any type of Persian or Iranian scholar, they would say it would have been impossible in hundreds and hundreds of years for Moscow and Tehran to ever have this kind of relationship. And somehow, just like the Americans have pushed the Chinese and the Russians closer together, we did the same thing with Moscow and Tehran, something that historically is impossible. It's like me being a New York Giants fan, as if I'm going to root for the Eagles. You know what I mean? Like, that's just not, like that type of relationship. So, I think there's a lot looking at this in terms of where it can go. I think the Russians definitely do have the upper hand now. The Ukrainians, I'm afraid that if there is any regime change that happens in the next year, it's going to be in Kyiv, that you're going to see a removal of Zelensky with someone more to his right. I think that's be a very dangerous thing. I also think, too, that as Scott has been talking about, the issues within NATO itself, in particular with Germany, a lot of that was mitigated by the fact that Europe just had its warmest January on record. If you had a typical cold German winter and energy prices were through the roof, and now you've got the United States is responsible for this because you blew up the pipeline, how does the German public react? How does the German government react? And you already see a split now between the German chancellor and his foreign minister. How deeper would that split have been if you had a cold winter in Germany, and the German people who are already hurting economically from this war are now made destitute because of it? So I think we dodged the bullet here. But the one thing I will also say, though, you're seeing a lot more conversation in Washington, D.C. about ending this war than you were 3 years ago. And I think that's got a lot to do with China. I think when you read things from, say, Mike Rogers, the Republican chair of the House Armed Services Committee, saying that the war has to end by summer, I think what he's talking about is China. And I think that you just had a big study come out from the Center for Strategic and International Studies that said America is running out of weapons, we're running out of our rockets, we're running out of our missiles. And I think what their people are saying to particularly, say, the generals in the Pentagon, who Scott alludes to, who may not want this war with Ukraine and Russia, they're alluding to this. We have to go, if we want to fight China, we have to start building up our stocks. And so we have to concentrate on the war that we want, the enemy that we want, and not this distraction in Europe that we are losing, by the way, I think is how a lot of them would phrase it. So I think there's a lot going on here. It's moving. It's very dynamic, and I think we always have to remember the amount of suffering that is occurring And that, again, it can go out. We don't know where this is going to go. And as we try and make predictions and analyze it, we have to keep that degree of humility that we may be discussing an entirely different conflict in 6 months' time. And with always that danger, as we began with, this idea that escalation is a ladder. You either go up it or you go down it. And you keep, maybe for people who maybe not understand what we're talking about here, would say with like, how are the tanks escalatory? Well, as soon as the United States announced that it was going to send Abrams tanks, you had Russian commentators saying, well, this means we now have to strike the marshaling yards, the logistics facilities, the training yards in Poland that will bring these tanks into Ukraine. And so you can see how that escalation starts happening on both sides. And so when the Poles hear that, they say, well, hang on, we got to do something because the Russians are now talking about striking Poland because we're going to be shipping these tanks into Ukraine. This is how the escalation works, right? You know, I mean, and so if people are not sure how this is, it's a reaction, counter reaction. And I will wrap this up because you asked me before, Randy, and I really didn't give an answer to it about the battlefield. The battlefield is the most competitive place you can ever be. And I was a combat engineer, and we did a lot of counter IED work. We went out looking for the roadside bombs, and we would get pushed new technologies, or we would get, ground penetrating radar and things like that to look for these IEDs, or we developed new tactics to try and counter them and find them. And we knew that within 45 days of us developing a tactic, or by bringing in a new piece of equipment, the insurgency had developed a counter to our countermeasure. So, I mean, it's that type of dynamic, that type of relationship, that type of reaction, counter reaction that warfare is. And that's what we can expect to see. And this is why we say it's so dangerous what's happening here, the escalation, where it could lead to this, where we get to the point where, as I think it was JFK, you guys correct me, didn't JFK say that you don't ever want to put a nuclear powered nation, give them the choice of a humiliating defeat or nuclear war, and we get back to this point again.
Well, listen, before Daniel answers all of that, we got to take a quick music break. Is everybody good here? Everybody good to go to continue? All right, we're going to take a quick music break. This is something that's going to be forbidden soon. This is Shostakovich, Dmitry Shostakovich. We'll be right back with these three Marines. Hey, we're back. That was Dmitry Shostakovich, a sweet variety of thing. I'm Randy Credico. This is Randy Credico Live on the Fly on the Progressive Radio Network and on WBAI, Free Speech Radio in New York City. And you can watch the video, by the way, folks, at randycredico.com, Assange Countdown to Freedom.com. It will be on our Live on the Fly YouTube channel and many others. All right, Kelly puts them everywhere. Now we're going to come back. So this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm not sure I'm really part of it. I'm here getting an education. So we're going to go to you, Daniel, and address first the hysteria that's going on right now. The mass hysteria. You can't drink Stolichnaya. You can't read Dostoevsky. Russians are all bad. This is like you had the Red Scare 1, Red Scare 2. Now this is the Bear Scare number 1. All right?
Look, for a good 20 years, I've been asking myself, why are we treating Russia as a, quote, enemy? Why is the demonizing of Russia going on as it was? And that, not to the point you described, it hasn't arrived yet. But why do we treat it with the word enemy comes up? How is Russia our enemy? Myself. And the only answer I could come to was that the possibility of selling weapons to former East Europe, to the new NATO members and the others, that Russia had to be an enemy of some kind for them to have to defend themselves against that and sell them all these weapons. I don't think that was wrong, Charlie. I don't think that was the only motive involved here. But the I think they have now and I'm sorry, maybe we'll get a disagreement with friends here, but it seems to me very clearly that what the U.S. sought to provoke and did provoke was aggression by Russia. It's not seen that way by most Russians, certainly at this point. But then Americans to this day have not perceived that the U.S. and 31 other nations committed aggression in Iraq. They've never admitted that. But straightforward crime against the peace, violation of the UN Charter, tanks across the border, and so forth. And there are a lot of people in the U.S. right now who try to understand this, do their best to understand this, but without using the word that what Russia was, let's say, provoked into doing was aggression. The analogy is made to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, I was very involved in the latter stage after the president's speech last week in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I didn't perceive then what I perceive very clearly now in the context of Ukraine. And that is that what Kennedy, and I didn't know this at the time, had been preparing for over a year was a U.S. invasion of Cuba, where we were going to do false flag operations to analogize, to get us in. For a year before any Russian missiles, or any Russians at all, were in Cuba. I don't know if you were all any of you were in the 2nd Marine Division, as I was, but they were doing exercises of the kind I helped plan when I was in the Marines, 54, 57, much shorter than my two friends here. Was an invasion of Cuba, or as the plans put it, Ortsac, Castro spelled backwards. And it wasn't too disguised, actually, as to what the objective. Now, what would that invasion have been? Aggression. Clear-cut aggression. How about when Russians go in, but not get with their missiles? The U.S. Congress, and especially the Republicans, but both sides, wanted a U.S. invasion to stop that. Aggression. Cuba, our sphere of influence, the Monroe Doctrine. That's treating Cuba as in our sphere of influence, as every American did, meaning we have a right to decide who they invite in, what bases occur over there. They can't decide that. They have limited sovereignty. We decide that. Okay, Russia is indeed claiming the same for Ukraine now. And they're not behaving worse than the U.S. did in Cuba, or better, actually. And had the U.S. gone in, as I say, at that time, we would have blown the world up, which we didn't realize at the time, because so many missiles, Russian warheads were there that we didn't know were there. So it would have been a disaster. Let me come to this immediate situation and see if there's any issues that are controversial between us. Obviously, there's a lot of agreement, it seems to me. But, for example, the issue of who will be in charge in Kiev a year from now. If I understand Matthew, he was saying that he thinks Zelensky would be out and someone to his right. That's not good news. It's very.
I think that's a danger. I think that's a danger, Dan. I don't think that's likely, but I think it's a danger that we have to. That I don't think people in Washington are taken seriously enough, or what would come from that if that were to happen. I think it's. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's a possibility that has to be entertained.
Okay, I accept your correction there, but if Scott is right, on the other hand, he didn't say on this. Whoever is in Kiev a year from now, the Ukrainian, will be presiding over a demolished Ukrainian army. Now, Scott make a clear prediction on that, acknowledging that everybody can be wrong. Look, a year a year from now, actually, by next September, it'll be interesting to replay this. And the Ukrainian army, the war will be over. Now, in that sense, if you're confident of that, without being certain of course, you're a lot more optimistic than I am. Because I'm not at all confident the war will be over a year from now. One way or the other. I think that the possibility of this going on at much the same level as now, an escalating stalemate, is a real possibility, to say the least. Definite possibility. And a war being over in the fall would be different from that. So I think this really could go on. Now, what Scott has not mentioned, and I do want to raise it now, is the Ukrainian army being demolished and thrust out of Odessa and Kharkiv. Used to be Kharkov. Kharkiv is going on. Is that what's that going to do to escalation on the U.S. side, and very specifically, U.S. direct combat participation in terms of air power? Troops, much less likely and much less decisive. But in terms of air power, that makes a difference. I haven't heard Scott mention that possibility. I'm very worried about events moving in such a direction that the U.S. participates directly. Now, Scott has actually mentioned a much bigger leap into U.S. nuclear war initiation. I think that's very unlikely. Scott is, of course, quite right, and he knows that I've been saying this for many years. The U.S. has been the one who not only maintains a first-use policy, we have a right to initiate nuclear, as does Russia. China doesn't, as Russia. But the U.S. has made those threats dozens of times, Russia not. But there was a reason for that. In those earlier days, Russian conventional superiority in Europe was very obvious. And the U.S. was continuously, including when I was in over Berlin, threatening first-use nuclear weapons, just as Russia is now doing for the first time, really. And really, in no case has the word nuclear, has the threats been as clear-cut. They've been private, but public never been as clear as they are for Putin. Not the U.S. I think it's extremely unlikely the U.S. would initiate nuclear war in Europe. Why? The difference in posture and declaratory posture, for obvious reasons. The Warsaw Pact changed sides. They reversed alliances. They're now all in NATO. So the conventional balance has been transformed. And now it's Russia that's talking about first use. Isn't this a case then when Joe Biden, now I'm going to introduce something we haven't talked about. Isn't this a case when Joe Biden could afford to say, and would be very good to say, no first use? Neither of us. And we unilaterally say, no first use, we will not initiate nuclear war, unlike you, Putin. We challenge you to join that. Yes, we've said it in the past, but it's over, it's outmoded. It's right, no first use. Biden promised to do that in his campaign. He actually said he would do that in his campaign. He has not done it, and he will not. Why? Not because he's pressed in Ukraine. There's a lot of things he can do to escalate before he gets to that point. The F-16s don't have to be given to Ukraine. They can have U.S. pilots and F-22s and F-135s if they can fly. And if there's no thunderstorms in Ukraine, you can't fly. You can't fly an F-35 within 25 miles of a thunderstorm because their lightning defenses don't work. So we throw them in. We can do all that before nuclear war. Why will Biden not say at last what he promised to say? We will not initiate nuclear war, in contrast to Russia now, because he wants that threat for Taiwan. And whether he wants it or not, he has to save it for Taiwan, because there the conventional balance has again shifted very strongly against the U.S. on Taiwan, and he would be accused immediately, if he said no first use, he would be accused in Congress on both parties of inviting an invasion of Taiwan. And if there was conflict in Taiwan, he would hear it's because Biden lowered deterrence here, and he said, so he isn't going to say it. And finally then, is this my feedback here? Sorry.
Yeah.
It's doing it. Yeah, I know it's doing it. Let me just, see if it's this, I'll turn it off. that my worries are in contrast to Scott. I don't think this war will be settled militarily. Well,
All right, let me figure that out. Scott.
huh? Bad.
All right.
Sorry. Okay, I turned off my iPhone. I don't think. I'm not saying anything.
All right, we're going to go to Scott. Why don't you figure that out?
No, okay, let me, in danger of this, let me try in 2 minutes or 1 minute. I don't think the war will be decided militarily by either side in the spring or in the fall. It can't be settled by compromise now because each side believes it can improve its position by another offensive. And I don't think either of them will give up. We're sort of like World War I here, a bloody stalemate that each side thinks better than compromise now, I'll give it another crack. But with those, I think most likely they'll both fail. Scott, I defer to Scott's expertise here, but as we all say, the uncertainty is defined by this. There wasn't a person in the world, I put it, and not in this round table, none of us here, but there wasn't a person in the world who foresaw a year ago that the lines in Ukraine would be where they are now. No one, not Russia, not the U.S., nobody. And so the uncertainties are very great. And it'll be, I do hope this war gets ended before one side, and I'm afraid, I believe that would be Russia in this case, decides to shock everybody into negotiations by using a nuclear weapon. Or one or two little nuclear weapons. But I don't think that'll happen just by militarily, by one side or the other way. So I don't think either of these offensives will prove decisive. Maybe Scott does foresee that, but by the end of the summer, he foresees it. The U.S. would be in directly, and that means NATO, indirectly, I think, before they allow that to happen. Is the U.S. a nuclear power that's going to allow itself to be defeated by Russia without escalating in a way that at the very least prolongs the war beyond next fall?
All right. Everything sounds good. This has been great. I'm going to give you, Scott, and then you, Matthew, the closing. We got to and take your time. You guys get the closing remarks, and then we'll have one last rebuttal by you, Daniel. But go ahead and take your time.
I thought we just run out of time here, but that's okay.
All right. No, I got to give these two guys their time, and if you have anything to say, you'll get the last voice in there.
I'll forego that.
Well,
I might change my mind, though.
all right, so go ahead, Scott, and then Matthew, and leave me out of this, please. I'm just enjoying it.
Well, first of all, I think both Matthew and Daniel are 110% correct. Anybody who has the hubris to say, I know exactly how this is going to end, should probably be disinvited from your show immediately, because that's not constructive at all. We all have our internal biases. We all have our analytical personal analytical algorithms that are shaped by our experiences. And that's wonderful, because I think anybody watching this program is getting 3 informed takes on a very complicated topic. So, there's no disagreement here. I don't have a position. I'm not trying to win an argument. We're having a discussion where I'm putting out some analysis and people are pushing back. And I think that's awesome. Really good stuff. I will touch on a couple things. Matt, if you excuse me, I'm going to build on your escalator, because I think that's just a fantastic analogy for people to understand.
I wish I could take credit for that. One of the guys who hosts the Duran podcast is where I first heard that. So I wish I could take credit, but isn't it?
How about the escalation elevator? Is that you?
No, escalation ladder. That's a common. That's a.
I heard
who
escalation
came up with that.
ladder,
Yeah. But escalation escalator. Yeah, is a really wonderful.
I'll take credit for it. All right.
Okay, but look, this, as Matt pointed out, this conflict should have ended sometime in March, April. Russia had no intention of making it go beyond March, April. People need to understand that when they say, why didn't Russia do X, Y, and Z? Russia's special military operation was designed to create political conditions for a negotiated settlement early on in this conflict, and it was successful. It would have succeeded had it not been for the intervention, the escalation of the United States and NATO, which perceived a Russian weakness that could be exploited and went into a new lend-lease, billions of dollars, changing the dynamic, a game changer, I called it at the time. And it was, the game changed. It went from being a Russian-Ukrainian conflict into a Russian conflict where Ukraine is now a proxy of NATO. And now we've seen further escalation. One of the biggest escalations, and here, Daniel, I'm going to talk about Kharkov. Kharkov may have been off the map, but the United States put it on the map. And the reason why I say this is Russia has made it clear that they are going to liberate every square inch of the 4 territories that have been recently acquired. There will be no piece of Russian territory left in the hands of Ukraine. That means the right bank of Kherson belongs to Russia. All of Zaporizhia belongs to Russia. All of Donetsk belongs to Russia. All of Lugansk belongs to Russia. And given what Ukraine has done in terms of shelling civilian population centers in these, Russia has said that they will not allow the Ukrainian military to be within artillery range of Russian territory. So prior, with the HIMARS, Russia said, we're going to push you back 80 kilometers. 80 kilometers. So if you fire a HIMARS from Ukrainian territory, it can't reach Russia, and that's just the way it's going to be. Kharkov would have been spared at that point, but now we're talking about sending in the upgrade, the small bomb guided missile upgrade with a 150-kilometer range. All this did is guarantee that Russia will now take Kharkov. It's a 100% guarantee. 100% guarantee that Russia has the taking of Kharkov as an objective, because you can't let Kharkov stay, because then they can fire these new munitions into Russian territory. So again, the escalation has taken place. So this is going to happen. Russia is going to make a play on Kharkov. It's a guarantee. All you have to do is take a compass and draw a 150-kilometer radius around the borders of the 4 Russian territories, and now you have defined where Russia's going. Now we have to modify those lines based upon geographical reality. And one of the geographical realities is that Odessa now comes into play. And so I believe that Russia, and there's another thing that we're not talking about, which is Transnistria, 400,000 pro-Russians stuck in the middle of between Ukraine and Moldova. Russia's not going to leave them hanging, not after all this. So I believe that whatever settlement takes place, whether it's a military corridor or a political corridor, there is going to be some sort of corridor connecting Transnistria with the rest of Russia. Does the United States intervene? Now, with all due respect to the American military, I will tell you right now that the United States will run out of air-to-air missiles in Europe before Russia runs out of airplanes. That's just 100% guarantee. We're not equipped, stocked, prepared, ready for war. We just simply don't have the stockpiles in there. We don't have enough artillery ammunition to last a week and a half of sustained ground combat. We don't have enough of anything to do anything in Europe, whereas the Russians do. So the escalation ladder, elevator, in this case, escalator, or, if the United States chooses to escalate, this is where I said what I said. Russia will never use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Russia will never, ever, 100% certainty, ever use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. If Russia was compelled to use nuclear weapons, they would take out Paris, London, Berlin, Brussels, all that. They will never use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. That's my belief. But Russia doesn't need to use nuclear weapons because their nuclear posture isn't being threatened by anything other than the potential of an American preemptive nuclear strike. And if the United States chooses to escalate because Russia moves into Kharkov or Odessa, the United States will lose militarily. We don't have the military means in NATO. Look at Poland. And here's the biggest threat to anything is the Poles. The Poles are insane and they should be suppressed. When you have a 165,000 man army that literally can't maneuver out of its barracks, talking that they're going to pump up to 300,000 and they're going to make a move in Western Ukraine at a time when the Russians have over 100,000 troops in Belarus backed up by hundreds of thousands of Belarusian forces, meaning they have a 500,000 man army right there in Belarus ready to strike right now. The best Poland will ever be able to do is put 80,000 troops into Western Ukraine, and they will die within a month because the Russians will come down and take them out. And now we have an Article 4, not an Article 5, but an Article 4 engagement with NATO. And then what? The Baltic states have no military capacity whatsoever. If the Russians decide to move on the Baltic states, they will be gone in a week. They have no capacity to resist. The NATO battle groups aren't even a tripwire. They are a reinforced battalion that will be annihilated in the first 2 days of combat. NATO has no means to resist. There's no way you're going to get the British brigade because they can't leave London. The Brits have nothing. France can't deploy to Africa with a 6,000-man force without American airlift. And if you think American air power is moving in the in the Eastern Ukraine theater of operations, let me introduce you to what's called integrated air defense. The Russians have the most sophisticated, dense, integrated air defense in the world, and it's specifically designed to shoot down our aircraft. This isn't Iraq in 1991. This is Russia today with air defense that is designed to take down the F-22, the F-16, the F-15, the F-35. Anything we got, they will take it down, and they have more missiles than we have aircraft. And all of our stuff, Matt, you can attest to this, I think. In Afghanistan, we talked about total domain dominance against the Taliban, and we still lost. And we had it. We had perfect intelligence, perfect communications, perfect everything. We had satellites, airplanes flying over, communication relay. None of this will exist in a war with Russia. People need to understand that all the things that make everything work on the ground for America will disappear because all those satellites will go dark. There won't be satellite constellation over Europe. There won't be anything over Europe. And so all this perfect stuff that we need to do to fight ain't going to be there. You know who can fight with less than perfect conditions? The Russians. They're very good at freezing. They're very good at being hungry. They're very good at, being miserable, and they still fight. They still win because they don't need any of this stuff. So I think the U.S., here's the danger. We're going to think that we can escalate and achieve a certain outcome, and it's going to fizzle, and it's going to backfire. And as you said, Daniel, the U.S. isn't going to sit there and let ourselves be beat by the Russians. If the Poles go into Western Ukraine and there becomes a general conflict between a Russian-Belarus intervention and the Poles, and then the Balts decide to intervene to help the Poles, we now have a NATO-Russian conflict that will mean Russian troops head towards Warsaw, that will mean that Tallinn, Vilnius, and the other capital that I get, Riga, will no longer be NATO territories. And now what does the United States do? Because Joe Biden has said, Article 5 is a religious, it's a holy, it's a commitment. Okay, Joe, now what? You provoke the bear, and now the bear's eating your cubs. What are you going to do? Go nuclear? That's the only option we have left. And that's the danger. And then I'll leave with this. We talked about this, Daniel, before. The W-76-2. I think every American needs to ingrain those numbers in their head because that's what's going to kill all of us. Right there. Every one of us is going to die because Joe Biden is going to be told by some idiot in the Pentagon that, hey, all you have to do is escalate to de-escalate. You want to get them Russians to back down, Joe? Escalate to de-escalate. They're driving on Riga right now, Joe. Take a W-76-2 and fire it from a submarine, knock it off the coast, take some of those Russians out, and the Russians will back down. No, they won't. The Russians will immediately launch everything they have, and the world is over tomorrow. So, and everybody can say, well, Scott, that's irresponsible to say. Well, ask Mark Esper what was going through his head when he was in Omaha pushing the button to launch a W-76-2 against a Russian force in a scenario that involved the Baltics. We aren't talking hypothetical, ladies and gentlemen. We have active nuclear war plans for this very possibility. The world will end. And this is what I want to get across. The world will end. Now, I could be wrong, Daniel. I could, and I hope I am. I pray I am. I'd love nothing more to wake up tomorrow and find out that I'm wrong on everything. I will sleep so much better. But why do we have to live in a world where what I just said is a possibility? Why do we have to live in a world where such an outcome can even be hypothesized by somebody as crazy as Scott Ritter? Why, and now we come down to the thing that should stop it, which is arms control. Arms control could stop this. In 1987, we got the INF Treaty. I was a part of that. I personally believe the INF Treaty saved the world. Daniel, you mentioned a couple things that happened in 1983. Let's mention one that happened. Okay, we mentioned the two in 83. In 83, we still didn't have the Pershing II missile deployed into Europe yet. Had the Pershing II missile been in the U.S. nuclear arsenal during Able Archer, do you think Andropov would have been more relieved or less relieved, knowing that nuclear missiles are now 5 minutes away from hitting Moscow? I think he would have been more likely to hit the button. But the one that would have killed us took place in 1995 when the Norwegians fired an atmospheric rocket that happened to mimic the flight path of a Trident missile on its way to carry out an EMP blinding attack. And the Russians went, holy cow. And they actually took the nuclear briefcase to Yeltsin. Yeltsin opened it up and he said, what do you want me to do? And they said, launch, baby, launch. And Yeltsin went, well, wait a minute. And fortunately, they had about a 12 to 15-minute buffer. And Yeltsin was told it's a Norwegian test. Now imagine if we didn't have the INF Treaty and they had Pershing IIs that could hit Moscow in 5 minutes and he didn't have that 12-minute launch. Do you think he would have waited or do you think he would have launched? None of us would be here today without the INF Treaty. That's my personal belief. We need to be stalking arms control right now, and we're not. The Russians and the Americans aren't talking. And why? Because of Ukraine. The Russians have said, we cannot talk with you about fundamental issues like arms control so long as you are engaged in a policy designed to bring our government down and destroy us as a nation. This is the most important thing here. Wherever you stand on this issue, right or wrong, understand you better care about yourselves first. You better care about your lives, your grandchildren's lives, your children's lives, because they're all going to go away if one mistake is made. And I think the United States is backing itself up into a corner. And I think as long as we have that idiot plan where the W-76-2 could be launched as an escalate to de-escalate scenario against a Russian aggression against the Baltics that are going to be provoked by the Baltics responding to a Polish incursion. I mean, we could just go on and on and on and on. We don't need to live in this kind of world. And yet that's the world we live in.
Wow. Would you repeat all of that? No, I'm kidding.
Could I ask a question?
No, you got to go to Matthew, then you, unless you have a quick question for him.
Question to Scott. Listening to you, Scott, very, very impressive. But I asked myself when I hear you, and this is the question, why then was Russia concerned about Ukraine joining NATO and NATO being on Russian borders, given what you've described as the actual balance of forces?
Well, first of all, Russia's balance of forces are orders of magnitude improved today than they were in this time last year. As I mentioned, Russia's defense industry wasn't chugging on all cylinders. People don't understand what Russia did over the course of the summer.
They could, though. No, NATO, Ukraine being in NATO would not stop Russian industries from gearing up and doing. They could have done all that without invading.
The United States has been pushing since the mid-'90s for the dismemberment of Russia.
You keep saying the dismemberment of Russia, Scott, but I don't get that. Cheney, of course, definitely was in favor of the dismemberment of Russia. The dismemberment of the USSR, the Soviet Union, even, has been the objective. I haven't heard the dismemberment of Russia as being other than a very wonderful hope. Someday,
I think the Russians believe that the Chechen conflict was a definite effort by the CIA.
Were they right? Was that true? I'd be very interested.
100% true that the CIA was involved in spreading radical jihadism into Chechnya for the purpose of destabilizing Chechnya and stripping it away, creating a chain reaction that would lead to Tataria, Bashkiria, Udmurtia, etc., all withdrawing.
That's very interesting. I can easily believe that, but do you have any references on that, Scott? I've never heard that asserted. I've never heard it.
Well, I mean, Putin himself said that when he talked to Clinton and said, "Hey, we'd like to join NATO," he said, "I knew what the answer would be because we knew what the United States was doing in Chechnya."
That's a reference from Putin, which I'd like to have. Could you just send me that? If it referred to Chechnya,
I would definitely, and I will get. Look, it's a topic that's been ignored here in the West because we pretend we don't do these things. But
no question we do these things. But I'm not aware that Chechnya was an example. That's all.
Sure. Okay. I'll do that. But I just think that when let's put it this way. Let's assume, let's make the following. Let's do the following hypothesis that the United States wasn't trying to do this. Okay, let's put that.
They'd like to do it, but I don't. not aware that
But
Chechnya.
that's not the important thing. The important thing is what the Russians believe. Perception is more important than reality. So let's say the United States wasn't doing this, but the Russians perceive them to be doing it, and therefore that perception becomes reality in the Russian mind. That's what makes Ukraine important, because the Russians are convinced that the United States is in fact engaged in a policy designed to dismember Russia. And if with that in mind, and again, we go back to the 2019 RAND report that talked about the criticality of taking Ukraine out of the Russian orbit to achieve the dismemberment of Russia. That's written right there in the RAND report.
The Russians do not believe what Scott Ritter says about Russian escalation dominance in that area, which is what I heard from you. They don't agree with you as to their ability to easily master any escalation.
Well, there's no such thing as easily master. War, nothing easy in war, and there's no guaranteed outcome in war. But I will guarantee you that the Russian general staff is prepared for escalation. That nothing that could happen, nothing I just said is going to take any Russian general by surprise, and they have plans on the books. And here's the difference. The Russian plans are actually backed by physical structures, forces, munitions, etc. NATO plans are backed by potential. Again, it's a classified number, but the number of air-to-air missiles on hand in Europe today are not conducive for a major conflict with Russia, which means the aircraft that we think we can sortie into the air, understanding that the airfields will not exist after a certain period of time through non-nuclear precision strikes, aren't going to have the capacity to penetrate and sustain conflict.
Who produces our air missiles? Is it Raytheon? Who produces
Raytheon, Lockheed Martin? I mean, Boeing. I don't know. I mean, we have different.
We find out which one and buy that stock if you don't care.
And buy their stock, because I'm just pumping their stock right now, right? Is that what you're saying? I'm pimping them.
If the Russians can mobilize, the U.S. can mobilize it. The military-industrial complex would like nothing better.
Right, but here's the difference, Dan, and again, you know this. That Raytheon can't start producing missiles on its own. Raytheon can't go today. The CEO can't go start cranking out the AIM-190 production line. Get it up, boys. Get it up, boys. Get it up, boys. First of all, it's a defense contract. They can't do it on their own. The defense has proprietary over it.
The Democrats and Republicans will join arms in showering all the money that's needed.
But they haven't done that.
Oh, they will. They would. They don't need it yet.
Right, but Raytheon
do. You say they do, but we'll see.
But then Raytheon has to build a production line.
We won't deny our pilots the bullets they need.
Right, but you still need the production line, Dan.
Yeah.
And it's not there.
They are adding production lines right now at Raytheon and Lockheed right now. They are.
Then that makes things interesting. All right.
We're going to move on here, guys. We only have a few minutes left. Scott, I got to get you in. Scott, here I go again. Captain, not field commander only, but captain.
He was a captain in the field. He, like me, Matthew, had the best command in the world, I think, a Marine company. But he had, which I had, wonderful, but he had it in combat, which is, I defer.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I just want to, the dangers that we have here, and I want to get back to Scott's point about the W-76 too, which most people probably don't know, but we should all know this because that is a doomsday device. They're on the doomsday. If you all haven't read Dan or Scott's books, please go out and read them. The time to read them is not when we're all sitting on the piles of rubble of our homes, watching our children die during nuclear winter. The time to read them is now. But when I resigned from my post in Afghanistan, I had to go and meet with the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. And the PAB at that point was composed. It was led by Chuck Hagel and David Boren, two former senators. Chuck Hagel at that point was at Georgetown University. David Boren was president of University of Oklahoma. And what they brought me in for was like, look, they said, hey, I'm reading your stuff. I'm reading what you're saying in the Washington Post, and this matches up exactly with what all the military officers who are coming through our colleges are telling us about the war in Afghanistan. And none of this is making it onto the president's desk. Why is this? Why do we have this disconnect? And this is what they wanted to talk about. when Scott talks about this idea that Biden could be presented with this idea that this plan, we're going to fire a single W-76-2, which has a warhead that's smaller than the Hiroshima bomb, and it will be a warning. And this is one of the usable nuclear weapons that we can utilize to escalate, to de-escalate. And these are real things that they talk about. You have generals and admirals who speak about usable nuclear weapons. Well, the problem with that is, and why Scott said the Russians would immediately retaliate with their full force. The Russians can't tell a difference between a D5 submarine-launched ballistic missile that has a W-76-2 with a 5-kiloton warhead or whatever it is, and a W-88 or one with a W-88 warhead, which has like a 500 kiloton, right? A city destroyer warhead, right? They have no way of telling the difference. I have a feeling that President Biden is given that plan, given that option. No one's going to tell him that. He's not going to know this on his own, right? He doesn't know that the W-76-2 and the W-88 ride the same type of missile out of the submarine, and the Russians have no way of telling the difference. I mean, these are the things we have to worry about, in the sense of what are they being told? What type of information is going to our leadership here? I think as we kind of look again at the war in Ukraine, I'm thinking about how Dan, Scott, and I were all taught in the Marine Corps how to make orders, how to make plans, whether you're going on the offense or on the defense. And the first thing you do is you put yourself in the shoes of the enemy, of your adversary, whether you call this tactical empathy, operational empathy, strategic empathy, whatever you're at, that's what you're supposed to do. If you build a defensive position, you're supposed to go out there before you even start digging and look at your position from the enemy's perspective. Right. And then all throughout, that's what you do. This way you understand what the enemy sees and you try and think as he would think. And what you're presented with when you do your orders are two things. You're supposed to come up with the enemy's most likely course of action and the enemy's most dangerous course of action. And herein, I think if we look at the Ukraine war, the most dangerous course of action, of course, is escalation leading to this nuclear conflict like what we've been talking about. Most likely, I think, it resembles probably, say, the Korean War in 1953. Where you have this stalemate that we've spoken about, where I think for as reasons we expressed, the Russians don't have a desire to expand the war further than that. The Ukrainians have no ability to expand the war further than that. You have this, I think one thing that favors the Russians as well is that the territories they've taken are favorable to them. They are not going to run into organized insurgencies like the Americans did in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are Russian-speaking areas that people have fled from. And if there are people there, they're probably those who are sympathetic to the Russian army. So I think this, and as well, we discussed earlier the strength of the economic support the Russians have received. First of all, I think the West completely misunderstood the depth of the Russian economy, the fact of how reliant the Russians are, self-reliant they are, how they're able to produce things we didn't think they could produce. They've proven all this in the last year. But then, two, the plugging in of the Indian, the Chinese, the Iranian, the Turks. We'll see what the Brazilians do, in terms of supporting the Russians. But the Ukrainians, again, are backed by the Americans with our world reserve currency. We can spend trillions and trillions of dollars on this, So, because we've done that in previous wars. So where does this go with the stalemate? What does that lead to? What are our options then? And we have seen that the Russians and the Ukrainians can and will negotiate. Not just with the talks we talked about back in February and March, but also, too, we've seen them talk and come to agreement on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We've seen them come to agreement on grain shipments through the Black Sea. Remember about 6 months ago that was having dire consequences around the world. People, particularly say in Africa and other food insecure nations, were dealing with the consequences of a third of the world's grain getting shut off. You're right. So, and we've also seen it with the fact that the Russians and Ukrainians regularly have prisoner of war exchanges. I think they've had 40 or something like that. So they're able to talk. They're able to work together. They're able to trust one another. And, so this idea we should not be listening to our media and our leaders who are saying the Russians won't talk. Again, it's exactly what I saw with the Sunni insurgency in Iraq. And then the Afghan Taliban with our leaders saying they won't talk to us, which is complete bull, complete lie. Only meant to keep the war going until we were victorious. And there was no victory in those wars, and there's no victory in this war either. So I think that the pressure that we need to put on, understanding the consequences of where this can go, understanding what's likely to come out of it, leads us to the point that we have to push for negotiations. We have to push for a ceasefire. We have to push for talks, and we have to push for some type of demilitarized, neutral status of that region, addressing the concerns of Russia, addressing the concerns of the Ukrainians. Look, I mean, I think what's so difficult for a lot of us is we live in a society that you're not allowed to discuss anything unless it's in strictly binary terms, unless it's in strictly A versus B, red versus blue, Trump versus Biden. Unless you're taught, we can't have these conversations. You can't have conversations with the complexity and nuance. So it's anathema in the United States, particularly say in Washington, D.C. or the corporate media studios in New York City, to say something like, I condemn the Russian invasion. I believe it was illegal. I believe it was aggression. I believe it was wrong. And at the same time say, I believe that NATO and the United States provoked this war. And this is a war that was a long time coming, a war that has made many, many people in D.C., London, Brussels, Kyiv very happy, just as this war has made very many people in Moscow very happy, right? So, I mean, these are all the things we have to struggle with, but the dangers of it and us not engaging on it as a public and not putting pressure on our elected officials to do what is necessary to end this thing before it escalates. And I'll say one last thing. As we were coming on here, I saw, we haven't talked much about China. We haven't talked about balloons and UFOs and everything, but that's heading exactly where I think most of us expected it would. Whereas we're getting on, I saw breaking news that the United States had just declared a no-fly area over Lake Michigan because of another UFO. Meanwhile, I woke up this morning and reports are coming out of China from Global Times, the Chinese media operation, but also from Bloomberg, that the Chinese are saying they're preparing to shoot down a UFO over the Yellow Sea. I saw something that Uruguay has declared. They've seen a UFO and they're going to shoot it down. I mean, so the hysteria here, the danger, and how that just leads into this escalation escalator, as we've been discussing. And we have to remember there's a lot of precedent for this. In 1983, the Soviet Union shot down a Korean airliner, killed 250, 300 people. 1988, the American Navy shot down an Iranian airliner, killed almost 300 people. The skipper of that ship, the USS Vincennes, that guy, the U.S. Navy gave a medal to after he killed all those people. I mean, so we have to, as we look at all this and understand it, we have to realize the motivations and the desires and the institutional greed that we're up against that want to see these wars prolonged because they think they can control it and benefit from it. We're just hearing Dan and Scott discuss the benefits to Raytheon and to Lockheed, about, and it just multiply that times 100, or actually I should say multiply that times 535 for all the members of Congress we have. And I think you get to see the problem of like the greed of all this, the way that people look at this conflict in the sense of how can we benefit from it, whether it be from our ability to make money or our ability to beat our chests and seem like, tough guy politicians, wartime politicians.
Wow. Let me, I was going to end it right there, but I'm trying to think of a solution here. A solution, Dan. We had the anti-war movement back then. There were members of the Senate, leaders, black leaders like Martin Luther King, who came out against the war in Vietnam. So there was a strong opposition. You don't see that right now. You don't see anyone in Congress. You don't have a senator like George McGovern there speaking out. You don't have someone like Robert Kennedy who spoke out against the Vietnam War. Both were killed. Not McGovern, but McGovern was killed in the 1972 election. But we don't have an anti-war movement, a viable one. How do we get out of this mess? I mean, this just seems like we're going to continue until we get to a point of no return. I mean, what can Americans do?
Well, I want to congratulate. First, I predicted I wouldn't have any last say here, but that was so. How many minutes ago was that? So I want to congratulate Matthew for raising the issue of what should we do in a policy here, because I have to say, I think neither Scott nor I really addressed that. Certainly, speaking for myself, I didn't get into it. But I want to endorse basically what you said in terms of a possible solution, as I understood it. It's along the lines, if I'm mistaken, of a pre-February 24th, 2022 situation in Ukraine, with Crimea essentially for now, for the foreseeable future, regarded as not under Kiev's control, Russian, how was it? Russian. And the effectively autonomy from Kiev, cities of the Donbass, basically. And one change being that we make explicit what has been implicit for 20 years, 25 years. Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, given the attitudes of many others, including France and Germany and Italy. It was never going to be in NATO. So we come out and say it. Okay, it's not going to be, not an assigned thing, but it's not going to be in NATO. And it's other arrangements. How about on the question of missiles in Europe? I'd be very glad to see an arrangement of no EM sites in Poland and Romania, I think, should be on the table there. And for that matter, the Iskanders in Kaliningrad could well be on the table. So the Russian missiles comparable. So yes, that's definitely, we want to see a negotiation. Now, Randy, when you ask, where in the political scene, let's remember something that's already gone down the memory hole. In October, just before the November elections, 36 members of Congress, progressives basically, who agreed that what we were confronting was aggression. They didn't go into provocation, but aggression in Russia, but said diplomacy should be our move now, negotiation, compromise, and so forth. Now, Pelosi got 35 of them to back away from that within 12 hours. And because Ro Khanna did not back away, he said, no, this is common sense. I'm not backing away from this. This is what we should do. But 35 of them were convinced you don't want to sound like Republicans just before the election. It should be an issue between us, and that sounds like Republicans. Now, why it does sound like Republicans is a very interesting question, but there is an overlap there. I saw the other day, for instance, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Of course, she's calling now for no more aid to Ukraine. But in the same context, she said the following words: "It would be insane to invade Crimea." Now, what could be more sober than that? That's an illustration of an Ellsberg axiom, which is you can't count on anyone to be wrong on everything all the time. And if Marjorie Taylor Greene could say that, why isn't it time for the 35 others to go back and join Ro Khanna and issue that goddamn statement again? We're not facing midterm elections now. Then our fear of looking like Republicans should not be a condition for against saying a self-evident right policy at this point. So yes, there should be. And in a way, finally, Scott, you really reassure me in various ways, given my other beliefs, when you say, I think you said 100% guarantee. I'd love to accept that, but that there will be no Russian missiles in Ukraine. Now, we do have to keep in mind that what used to be called Ukraine, a large part of it is now called Russia in Ukraine. I don't know if you meant to make that distinction. And matter of fact, the Chinese have had the single sane nuclear policy for 50 years here, no first use. However, when you talk to Chinese experts, which wasn't easy to do, but once in a while it comes out, they say, well, that doesn't apply to Taiwan. That's not part of China. It's an internal matter. It's a little disturbing. But they have built up now for 20 years in the vicinity of Taiwan to have an equal or superior conventional capability in the area of Taiwan. So now it's there again, as I revealed a year ago about our threats in 1958. We were threatening first and planning for first use in the Taiwan Straits against China to protect Quemoy and Matsu, but in the defense of Taiwan. Quemoy and Matsu, one of them was within a couple miles of mainland China. Anyway, I wanted to say, look, this is a real danger in Taiwan. But here, if I can accept, I don't believe the U.S. will use the 5 kiloton W-76 Mod 2 which, by the way, was introduced under Trump. The Democrats had fought that for a long time, and the idea of a low yield 5-kiloton weapon. The W76-1, which is most of the weapons on the Trident, is 90 kilotons. Or they have a W78, I think, which is 455 kilotons. So this is a little one. Yes, it shouldn't exist. And I don't think it will be used. I really am fairly confident, like Scott is, that the U.S. will not introduce that in Europe. I'm worried about it in Taiwan, but in Europe, I don't think so. But remember, Scott, when you talk about escalating to de-escalate with the demonstrative use of a small nuclear weapon, that phrase was not at all used when I was in fact, it was not used in American strategic discussion, except in the last 15 years as a translation of a Russian proposal. Not fully accepted as doctrine, but Russians were discussing in Russian, escalating to de-escalate. And people said, it's a crazy idea, which it is basically, but it had been NATO's implicit doctrine for a long time. Eisenhower had no escalate to de-escalate. Eisenhower said, no, if they cross the line here in Berlin, everything goes. The big introduction of the Kennedy administration, which I was part of, or consultant to, and then Johnson, was actually, as Lord Halpern put it, our policy in Europe is we fight conventionally if they cross the line. We fight conventionally as long as we can, which might be a day or 2 or 4 days. And then we use a single nuclear weapon to demonstrate our resolve and so forth. And then we blow the world up or surrender. So we had that, but it wasn't, we didn't give it a name, escalated. It was the Russians who did that. So that's what Putin is threatening. He talks about his capabilities. He speaks from a nuclear bunker. He's making threats now. And what's he threatening? I don't think he's threatening Washington as the first initiation of nuclear weapons. I don't think he's used the word tactical, but we all know that he has between 1,000 and 2,000 tactical weapons, and at least 1,000. And it talks about it all the time. We have 100 in Europe, which we shouldn't have, which we've insisted on having, because it's only our role as a nuclear protector of Europe, which would not be needed against the friendly Russian. But that gives us our role, that we have this. Yes, the French, the British have nuclear weapons, but they don't make Europe a protector. Europe has been a protector, and that is why the head of NATO, commander of NATO, has always been an American. Not because we have more divisions over there. That changes. Now, Scots see that all changing, going down. Fine for me. I've gotten arrested protesting against NATO continuing at the end of the Cold War in the last century. Fine with me. That's not going to happen now. I really disagree with you on that. I think we've gotten NATO forever. The military-industrial complex, the defense budget is not going to go down. ICBMs are not going to go away, though they are a dangerous trigger on the doomsday machine. The W76-2. And by the way, that one has just a 5-kiloton warhead. We have other warheads that are dialing yield that come down to 300 tons, a mere 300 tons, which is 20 times Blockbuster, World War II. But yeah, throw those around. Those are very dangerous. I'd like to see them get rid of them, but it's not going to happen now. I hope you're right that the war is over next fall.
I do too.
I don't foresee that.
I do.
But negotiate now. It's not going to happen. We're not going to negotiate now. But I think a real effort to get negotiations after the failure, I expect, of both of the new offensives this spring, that really is worthwhile. And I come back to a very concrete proposal. Press those 35 progressives who took back their proposal to negotiate. Say, hey guys, Pelosi's gone. The elections are over. come back with that and get more than 36 this time.
That's what I think. By the way, if I escalate this show, can we? I got about 7 minutes left. I'm going to have 2 shows out of this, so I think I'm going to escalate it to de-escalate it and escalate it back up to make this show 5 minutes less. I'm just joking here. What I'd like to do right now, I have 2 shows here, is get a 1 minute, minute and a half, what's called a Andy Rooney moment. All right, so you all have that Andy Rooney moment. You and then Matthew and then you, Danielle, the 3 Marines here. We got the Marine band. I want 1 minute, minute and a half. Close it out like Andy Rooney, and then I'm going to say goodbye with a scene from Paths of Glory, the movie that has his, World War I buried in trench warfare, a war that would have never ended possibly if the U.S. had not entered. I have no idea. I'm just joking. In fact, we're going to edit that out of there because that's a crazy statement, what I just said. We are going to play a scene when this is all over from the movie Paths of Glory, an anti-war film, and it's all about trench warfare. All right, so Scott, give us your Andy Rooney moment, and then Matthew, and then Dan. Minute and a half, all of you.
Tell me go.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Look, I entered the arms control business under Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. Verification is the business of governments. Trust is the business of nations. Nations are composed of people. Right now, the American people are incapable of trusting the Russians because we are infected with the disease of Russophobia. And because of this, the Russians no longer trust us. The Russians take a look at a track record of American betrayal in arms control from the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, Open Skies Treaty, the ongoing New START Treaty. Without arms control, the world ends. So the solution, I believe, is to break down this wall of Russophobia. I think at the end of the day, if we don't get the American people to trust the Russian people and the Russian people to trust the American people, their politicians will never trust one another, and we're all going to die. I look at 1982 and a million-man rally in Central Park in favor of nuclear disarmament. 5 years after that, we had the INF Treaty signed. And if you don't see a cause-and-effect relationship between 1 million people in New York City and Ronald Reagan, the arch-Cold Warrior, signing an arms control treaty, then you're blind. This is why I say the way to bring this about is 1 million people in New York City, June 2024, on the eve of a national election, to put pressure on both political parties, not about arms control specifics, but about breaking down the wall of mistrust between the American people and the Russian people. We have to learn how to reach out and touch one another, talk to one another, so that our politicians feel safe in moving forward. Why do those 35 politicians back away? Because they were sure they were going to lose votes. It's all about votes, and the way you make a politician believe in something is to say, we will not punish you for pursuing peace. So 1 million people, New York City, 2024, break down the walls of distrust, promote good relations between Russia and the United States, and we might save the world. Minute and a half.
I'll be there. Matthew, your Andy Rooney moment here.
Yeah, just to come off of 2 things that Scott said with the treaties, you could see the opposite with the how treaties, when we let them go, how things unravel. Now, the Chinese were never party to the Open Skies Treaty. The Open Skies Treaty was a treaty that the United States, Russia, and about 40 other nations were a part of for decades, that agreed that each country could overfly each other without shooting one another down. This, of course, comes out of the incidents in the 50s with Gary Francis Powers and all these things that kind of led to these crisis moments between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what you have now, though, is I feel like we're living in a Simpsons episode. I just saw, Twitter's telling me that, according to Congressman Jack Bergman, the United States Air Force just shot down another UFO over Lake Huron. As they're saying earlier, the Chinese are threatening to shoot down UFOs. Uruguay is talking about the madness of all this, almost to the point that I feel like we are living in a Simpsons episode here. This is insane. And this is why we had things like the Open Skies Treaty. And I think this was predictable. Now, the point that Scott makes about the Central Park rally in '82, that allows Reagan the political capital to do what he does with Gorbachev, absolutely so spot on. And we have to remember that we had in this century American political consequences for war. The Democrats take the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years because of the Iraq War in 2006. Barack Obama becomes the first black American president because of the Iraq War. He beats Hillary Clinton, then he beats the war hero John McCain in 2008. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that says that in 2016, Trump wins because voters who live in counties that were disproportionately affected by casualties from the Iraq War voted against Clinton because of the Iraq War, still in 2016. And that puts Trump over the top. So I wholeheartedly agree with Scott that we have to do something here, put that pressure on the politicians, because the alternative is to allow this madness to continue. And I think everyone who's listened to this can understand quite well where that goes, whether it be escalation in Ukraine leading to nuclear war, or, you know, what's happening now with the Chinese, where both sides are shooting things down that we can't even say what they are. Eventually, people are going to get killed. It plays into the hands of hardliners on both sides. And then you have the same type of escalator again that we're talking about, like in Europe.
I'm going to go out and fly a kite to see if that gets shot down. Nice windy weather up here near Ellenville, one of my favorite cities, Ellenville. All right, we're going to go to you, Dan. You remember Mickey Rooney and Andy Rooney. So give us don't do a tap dance like Mickey Rooney.
Yeah, let's put on a movie. Yeah, Mickey Rooney. A play. Listen, Scott didn't mention this. He might well have. I chose not to. That he's not only in favor of arms control, but that he was an inspector in Russia, actually verifying the actual destruction of actual missiles, and the only time that really happened. With respect to SS-20s in Russia, which along with the Pershing IIs in Europe, were the most dangerous weapon now, in the way that he's looking now at this low-yield little tactical weapon, the W76-2. But he actually dismantled those. And he's written about that in a book, which I recommend. Very good. What's the name of the book, Scott?
Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika.
Okay, very good. Let's have more of that. And Matthew, I was thinking the other day, in terms of a civilian official who actually leaves his high post in the war and comes back actively and publicly to denounce that war. That did not happen in Vietnam. There was no comparable act for that in the Vietnam War, and or in the Iraq War that I'm aware of. So I'm talking to two very, very unusual people in the back. By the way, I've never been called a Marine that much. I'm glad to have it in the company of these people. When people, I've never been willing to say as a civilian, I'm a Marine, because, the question is, I'm an ex-Marine, I'm a former Marine. But then a Marine who's present will say, once a Marine, always a Marine, you don't know which to say here.
I was actually going to go sign up today. In the Marines, just so it would add more to this show.
I once shook the hand when I was in the Sixth Fleet during the Suez Crisis of a guy at a restaurant, John Wayne, who was a draft dodger, a simple draft dodger in World War II, but who had recruited about a third of the Marine Corps in the Sands of Iwo Jima movie, and I was one of those. So there's a lot of
point here, Pilgrim.
A lot of fakery goes on all sides. And Matthew, as you were saying about these UFOs, and so actually it wasn't a UFO that we shot down, the Chinese balloon. It really was a Chinese balloon. And should we believe the Chinese that it was a weather balloon off course? I don't think so. We have to believe, I think Biden in this, I'm prepared to believe that in this case, Biden is closer to it when he says surveillance balloon, like the balloons we sent over Russia so long. What should we do? Yes, it's not going to happen now. I'm sorry to say, in the next few months, but yes, we should, whatever we think of the origins of this war, whatever controversy there is, we should be willing to negotiate as Zelensky, and I should say Ukraine and Russia, Putin, were doing at the end of March a year ago and early April, that was derailed by Boris Johnson, who said, It's too soon for negotiations. We don't want to make any negotiations. They had something close to a deal there, which looked rather like Minsk too, by the way, except that Ukraine would not be in NATO, which by then they knew they were not going to be in NATO anyway. So it had some other details there, but they had something like an agreement a year ago, or 11 months ago. And Boris Johnson went over and said, we will not be party to any agreements. It's premature, and the U.S. will not either, whatever agreement. Now, however the war began, and whoever provoked, and whoever answered, that intervention to prevent an agreement is a historic crime and not just an error, a crime. And what did it reflect? It reflected an attitude of the U.S. military-industrial complex and the U.S. as head of NATO. That's not just the military. That meant those people, the people at the heads there, I believe, want this war to go on indefinitely at this level. It's nothing but benefit for them. Ukrainian lives, yes, but who cares about them? And let me say, our leaders don't on either side. And when really, Scott, you talk about the Russians want to demolish the infrastructure of Ukraine, that's not the best example of brotherly Russian love at that point. The Ukrainians are Russians except for those Nazis. Ukrainians are Russians except for those Nazis. But it ain't only Nazis who are dying over there, definitely. And the Russian soldiers I'm concerned about too. But to leave that, to say no negotiations then was wrong, criminal, and we should get those back as soon as possible, in my opinion, which will not be right away. Cy Hersher's article, to leave on this point, gives me a hypothesis that I did not have a month ago before I read Cy's article. Why was it so premature in April 6th or so, when the Ukrainians were saying we're close to an agreement here? Russians said it's 75% agreement. Why was that premature? Nord Stream 2 hadn't been blown up yet.
Right.
We now know that they were already making preparations in late 2021 for scouting out how to blow up Nord Stream 2 if the Russians invaded. And I think that was a factor in our not being, I think we wanted the Russians to invade. And we didn't expect what we have now, nor did anybody in the world. This is even better because it sells even more weapons. Poor Ukrainians died, but it sells, and it puts us strongly in charge of NATO. But I think what they expected in the Russian invasion was a quick takeover, a few more killed in Crimea, a fait accompli, which nevertheless would give us an excuse to blow up Nord Stream 2, to cut off Russian gas from Germany, to put a barrier, an iron wall, you might call it, between Europe and Russia. And it would be our people who would sell them gas and oil, and we would be in charge of NATO, and NATO would not go away. It wouldn't have been as strengthened with a quick Russian fait accompli as it is now, but enough, and so forth. Okay, that's an attitude then, and I think has to be countered by us. And I don't count, I have to say, a million people come in this situation. It's a hard choice. I think but the fact that we do have some legislators that were willing at least to say negotiate, is something for us to build on. By the way, Lula of Brazil, President Lula of Brazil, has been calling on people in the global south and elsewhere. He's even said China, India, and Indonesia, other places, to get together as a large group and say, stop, enough, this has to stop. And what is their standing for saying that? People say, well, we don't want to tell the Ukrainians what to do. We're not in their defense. When it comes to the possibility of nuclear war, which is a reality, and which, as Matt pointed out, invokes nuclear Ritter, every person on this planet has standing to say, you have no right to confront us with the risk of that. whatever the issues are, this is intolerable. And, and I would like to see the world say.
On that point, you guys have been wonderful. I think, since I'm not a Marine and I want to do something musical, maybe I should play the theme music from Gomer Pyle. What do you think? Did you like that? I'll sing like Sergeant Carter. Golly, this has been a great show. I want to thank Captains Poe and Captain Ritter and First Lieutenant Ellsberg for really putting on. And I saw your dog. Do you have a dog over there? Everybody's got a dog in this fight here.
Yeah, I've got.
I see your dog.
I've got two.
First time I didn't hear his dog's barking, and I don't know. You have a dog, First Lieutenant Ellsberg?
No, that was I think that was my iPhone causing the feedback, not the dog.
It was actually the that wonderful balloon. Would you like to fly on a wonderful balloon? It just went by, and I don't know what music to go out with. I want to thank Kelly Lane, who's in North Carolina, for putting that all together, being there patiently, listening to my requests for this song and that song, and she's been there for 2 hours. This has been longer than the 30 Years' War. I want you to know that. But it was fascinating, and I learned a lot, and we have to do this again. We can do it just after the world ends or just before the next war. I don't know.
Well,
we have to do this again. Did you guys like this? Was it okay?
Yes, loved it.
Semper Fidelis, guys, or as they now say, Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
All right. So yes. All right. So what we have here is a song I want to play. We mentioned Mickey Rooney. I don't have a Mickey Rooney tune with Judy Garland available. I do have Joan Blondell from the Gold Diggers of 1933, which is one of the all-time great anti-war tunes. And it's all about World War I and the veterans who got screwed, Coxey's Army, all of that. And this is Joan Blondell and Etta Mooten. And it's My Forgotten Man. My Forgotten Man. And it's if you haven't seen the movie Gold Diggers of 1933, you've got to watch it. It's one of my favorites of all time. And this is a killer song at the end. So why don't you stick around, watch this, and let's all say goodbye to each other and get a picture together, okay? So don't go anywhere. Watch this. This is from Gold Diggers of 1933, a Busby Berkeley number.
Wait, in 1933 was when Major General Smedley Butler was offered to run a coup against FDR, in that because he abandoned the gold standard, and to run a coup on veterans, and he exposed it to the precursor to the House Un-American.
Well, here's the Gold Diggers of 1933, and that story about Smedley Butler, and Al Smith was part of that too, the governor of New York. I know all about that story. All right, here we go. We'll be right back just to say goodbye to each other. All right, we'll have one last shot of Stoller Steyer. All right.
Remember my forgotten man? You put a rifle in his hand. You sent him far away. You shouted, hip hooray! But look at him today. Remember my forgotten man. You had him cultivate the land. He walked behind a plow. The sweat fell from his brow. But look at him right now. And once he used to love me. I was happy then. He used to take care of me. Won't you bring him back again? 'Cause ever since the world began, a woman's got to have a man. Forgetting him, you see, means you're forgetting me. Like my forgotten man.
you're